All right, for today's episode, we've decided we're going to try something a little different. Not going to do our usual, just ridiculous intros like we usually do, because we're going to attempt to tackle a little more sensitive subject out in the matter.
Violence!
Yes, that's correct, Mike. Thank you for that. Yes, violence in video games. We're going to attempt to discuss whether or not we think it's justified.
Violence!
You know, we'll just use this as our intro. So, today's episode, we're going to break up into two separate parts. We're going to focus on, specifically, is the violence in The Last of Us justified? Yep. And then we're going to kind of weave our way into a little bit of a laid-back discussion about whether or not, what our take on violence in video games and the effect it potentially has on people, most importantly, probably kids in society.
Oh, kids. Oh, makes sense, yeah.
Kind of, it's kind of a deep talk.
Yep.
We good?
So I'm Michael, and we're just going to dive right in.
Yeah, I suppose. I'm Larry. We're still doing a podcast. You guys should know who we are. But so yeah, I'll just lay out the basic question for starters, just to kind of hear what your thought is. Was the violence in The Last of Us justified?
Justified? Yes, because I don't think TLoU is too violent.
I 100% agree with that. In the sense that, and I think the sticking point I will always have with The Last of Us, you're in a world, whether or not you want to say survival or not, it's a survival game. It's about people who are just trying to live. There is all manners of crap have hit the fan. There's infected. There's, the government. How trustworthy are they? Who knows? You have this other organization. You have a band of just random hunters and gangs kind of in and around just trying to live themselves. And whenever you put people in that kind of an extreme position, you're going to get this.
I know one of the criticisms I always see about post-apocalyptic worlds in general, they're like, why do they always devolve into killing, raping, any illicit acts against other human beings? It's obvious. I mean, that stuff happens now in our world where there's hope. If you have a world where there isn't hope, it's obviously going to be exacerbated. And it's just how it's going to go.
And I would say to that comment, I understand the hope that humanity isn't as awful as what usually we're portrayed as, but there's too many times in our history, and even to this day, like you just mentioned, when you boil down, you strip everything from a human being. They're going to do what they can to survive. Their instincts will kick in, and unfortunately, for better or worse, that kind of tends to be what humans... And now, obviously, you can sit here in your safe haven that you're at and think, I'd never do that. There's certain things, obviously, I would never do. But
agreed. At
what point, as far as the survival side of things, which Joel and Ellie are going through, and a lot of the other characters, Sam, Henry, all of them are going through in this game, you have moments where you kind of have to probably do some bad, I think you used the word illicit or just questionable actions to ensure the safety of, especially for Joel's case, Ellie.
It's all about surviving, and that's the whole thing. And I mean, the title itself, The Last of Us, you were the last human, so you got to survive. Do I think this game is overly violent? Yeah, at times. It's super gruesome, but I think it's, how I said it in my review, they did a tone and they stuck with it, and I appreciate that. I mean, Joel can get his face like half ripped off when he's getting beaten by a bat, or when the clickers rip out his throat. Like it's gruesome, but it paints a picture. And if you didn't have that violence in this game with the world around it, so the tone of the world, it's bleak and everything. If you didn't have the violence, I don't think it wouldn't be as grounded, and two, it wouldn't feel as authentic.
Yeah, I think the authenticity of it, I believe, goes a long way, because the idea that you could have a world where, when you shoot a zombie, for instance, and no blood comes out, I mean, you could get away with something like that, but you're still doing the action of shooting. The result of getting shot is you're going to bleed. And so the idea is you would take the guns away in a world like this. Well, that doesn't work when you have something that just by scratching at you, biting you in some way, you could get infected. You need something that takes care of them from a long distance. So I understand why you have to have the gun, quote unquote, violence in that sense, because you're using it as self-defense. Now, in The Last of Us, you see too, even at times where people are just kind of being jerks and shooting at you, there's still self-preservation involved in that. There's still, there's a group who look like they're a whole bunch of just mean individuals, but they still are protecting themselves. Maybe what they're doing is absolutely wrong, but they still need to eat. They still need shelter.
And that's how it's connected. David, a very creepy guy who's cannibals, and these rugged people that we are killing. And I also talked about how they're like clawing at you while you're choking them because they don't want to die. The preservation, like you said, you learn that David's not lying. He does have a family there. So it is a community, a family. So they are going out scavenging to feed families at home. Yes, they are cutting up and eating people. So it's kind of like...
So that's actually a question. I think I was going to initially save it for preserving memory, but I actually think it might make sense here. Is them being cannibals, is that something that you can... I don't want to say get behind is like a terrible way of saying that.
I know
but
what you
like...
mean.
In a world where food isn't always readily available, and obviously, we can look at it now, like eating, I mean, it just sounds awful to say, like eating human meat is obviously, there are a million trillion things wrong with it. Even as far as nutrients go, it's not good.
Yeah.
But if you're living in a world where, you can't go down the street to a Hy-Vee or a Target or a Walmart or Cub Foods, whatever, just being able to, like, if you're at the last bit and everyone is going to starve, is there at all any, like, okay, this is terrible?
That's the hard part. Without being, like, I can't picture that to a point, but I've never been to a point where I'm absolutely starving, like, 2 or 3 days on.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I should fast one of these days. And
Yeah. Yeah. I think, too, one of the things to think about is I think there's a difference between, like, oh, my gosh, are we actually having to do this sort of... Because, I mean, there's still the active... In theory, you had to kill somebody to get it done, but on the other hand,
what's the dead remains of your friend, and he's trying to feed you?
There's a gruesome. There seems to be a.
That's dead meat. Then that's gross too.
Yeah, there was also kind of like a. I'm trying to come up with a word, like a sadistic side to, like, they seemed like they almost were in a way kind of like they were enjoying it too much, sort of thing. Like it was a power trip for them. They were like, I'm eating man.
And it seems to be, in most cases of these post-apocalyptic worlds, there is a faction of, and I assume this is how it would work if this were to happen in our real life, when the world goes bad, there seems to be a camp of people that eat people and people that don't.
Yeah.
That seems to, in almost all these stories that we've experienced, games, whatever, there seems to be that.
Mm-hmm. And I would say this, like, it is insanely easy to say, I would never do that. I don't care what the circumstance is. And I don't know if I could ever even concoct a scenario where I could even feasibly do that. I would do everything I can to find other means. But if I boiled it down to, like, the absolute moment of, let's say it's like me, you, your wife, our brother, his girlfriend, my daughter, some friends, things like that.
Yep, I can't.
Like, I can't.
Yeah.
It's just...
I think it's the same line of, I'm never going to go out and rape somebody.
Yeah.
I know that. We talked about that. This already happens this day. People get raped. People die gruesomely. People are tortured. And that would probably be elevated when there's less hope. There's no... I don't know if the only way I'd ever torture somebody is if I had one of you in that situation. I need to get information. But I would never rape somebody. See, you know what I mean?
That's the big understanding. That's why I think there's so much power in that lakeside resort scene where Joel's... And I think Joel somewhat... maybe went a little too far, but
he definitely went too far.
But here's the thing, though: if the idea is these people who, if I don't kill them, are probably going to kill me and hurt the girl that I'm trying to protect, there's some, you got to remember, in the part that we're not always 100% aware of. There was a 20-year time jump at the beginning of the game. He's been dealing, and now plus all the actions that we've gone to up to that point, he's been in this world to a point so much further. I got to assume there's so much less humanity in him.
Oh.
And I mean, you lose a child, you're never the same ever. And there's probably a mental switch that just goes. You're just, there's something you're never going to get back. And the fact that he was able to even survive that, but then deal with who knows how much loss and how much bad stuff he's had to do since then.
I mean, even in the beginning of the story, you have him losing Tess when it sounds like there was something between those two. You never.
She says it herself.
Yeah, if there was something between us, you'll do this. And you don't know how far that went with them.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Yeah, I don't think I could ever cross the line of I'm going to be a cannibal. That just seems to be one of those things. Like, nope, yeah, I'm just going to starve to death. That's fine.
Yeah. There's definitely like now, but see, the thing is like you add that into the perspective of let's say you take your wife, for instance, she's starving to death. Do you do everything you can to get her anything? Like, what if you find a unfortunate human being who has passed away? You're able to behind the scenes cook the meat up and give it to her.
Nope.
You just let her starve.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. That would be her decision. I would cook it up for her. I'm just not going to eat it myself, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that's how I would go with it. Is The Last of Us 2 violent itself? Is it? I think any director can show whatever they want, can tell whatever story they want. And again, I just feel like it wouldn't be authentic. There's definitely post-apocalyptic worlds that are less violent. Well, Horizon Zero Dawn, Breath of the Wild. They're all don't. But yeah, it is weird. I guess if you think about it in that respect, it doesn't have to be as violent.
I mean, Final Fantasy X.
Yeah, that's basically a post-apocalyptic world too. Yeah.
See, I think the thing that's interesting is, and we got into a discussion about this. I think you were there. I was talking with I know a good buddy of mine I was talking to, and we were saying there's some justification in the fact that you got to stop saying you can't do something, because a developer, a storyteller, producer in any way, they should be 100% allowed to make whatever they want and use whatever means necessary. It is then the consumer side, our side, to decide, I don't like that and I'm not going to buy it. If enough people buy it, I mean, there's obviously something there for it. Whether or not, now there is some, I would assume there's some themes and ideas that you should just not publish, because there's probably people who are like, just because something's controversial, they'll buy it just cause.
That's true.
But I don't ever think you should ever say, no, this is too much of that, too much of that. It's up to the consumers to decide whether or not they went too far. And more importantly, and this is kind of my discussion going on to the other side of this, I think it's a social issue and a parenting issue more than it is the violence that's in a video game. The stuff that I think is getting passed off as, yeah, my kid can play this because I need an hour of my alone time, I think that's a bigger issue than the actual violence in the games or the movies and TV itself.
Okay, interesting. So it's not up to the creators, it's up to the consumer?
I just have and again, like that's a blanket statement. Obviously, someone could come in and nitpick, like, well, wait, so the creator should be allowed to do. There are things a creator shouldn't do, but I don't like putting a emphasis on they should be censoring themselves. If there's something they genuinely, that's supposed to be in a free society, you're supposed to be able to share your story. I mean, look at the gruesome things that are in books, but the problem is it's in writing form, so you're not visually seeing it. I think a lot of times visually seeing it on a screen is just more damaging, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
or at least it's easier to be like, hey, look what you're showing.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably easier to take a screen cap of that and be like, hey, look at this crazy scene. This is bad. Why are publishers doing this or developers doing this?
I mean, look at something like, compare like Last of Us to Call of Duty or something. Again, I'm not trying to like bash any one game, Battlefield. It's you're supposedly showing war, obviously, but it's started to turn into, like, especially with Call of Duty on the multiplayer side, it's just players shooting each other, killing each other. Mm-hmm. There's no rhyme or reason for why that's happening other than it's fun and it's competitive. On the Last of Us side, now there's the multiplayer side, but on the single player side, it's you're a guy trying to escort a little girl through a world to try and get her into it. Well, at first to sacrifice her, but afterward, and granted, he doesn't 100% necessarily know that.
No, he's just trying to pass her off.
Exactly. He just wants to hand her off to the next person. But then that's all you're doing. You're just surviving. And so, like, to me, there's a groundedness and an understanding of, I can understand why the violence is the way it is here. If you want to throw the violence argument, a game like Call of Duty with its, like, the single player campaign, sure, like, there actually is a story being told, even though I think in the newest one there's not even a story. But the multiplayer side of it is you're just aimlessly in an arena shooting each other. There's no justification for it. But
I mean, if you want to, then there's way more gruesome versions like the old Quakes or the Dooms.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
those are much more bloody and much more violent. So I guess we'll just move over to the second part, violence. Is violence in video games affecting society kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, so the questions would be, is violence in video games okay? Should they have a limit? Do studies show that people that play video games are more violent? And this has become a new thing because of what Trump said. Now let's start with there. There was a mass shooting.
Get political.
There was a mass shooting in March, I believe, earlier this year. And I don't even remember what it was. There's another thing we're going to go into because I'm just overexposed to shootings. So,
which is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely tragic thing that happens, and I can't even remember which one this was. That's a bad thing. So Trump comes. This is what Trump said after a shooting. This is his verbatim words. The video games, the movies, the internet stuff is so violent. That end quote right there. He goes on to say more, but I want to pick that part because two things are weird about this. One, did you see articles about movies or internet being too violent?
Just in general?
Yeah, after this. No.
No, not really.
It was all about video games.
Mm-hmm.
So why he did not put attention on it, he put attention on all three. Video games, the movies, the internet stuff.
I tend to have so my thing would be there's two issues going on here. One, for whatever reason, and it's still it's a bias that's going away. It's a stigma that's going away. But video games are still associated as something that kids play. TVs and movies are something that adults are also grouped in with. So the idea is you're affecting what kids do at a young age, and that's transitioning and transforming them into someone who doesn't care as much or is mentally unstable. I got to assume that's one of the areas they tend to go with on this.
It's an easy scapegoat.
It is. But the other thing is, it's the mental health and the gun control side of things. It's easy to just say, no, we can't get anywhere with this. So let's kick that bucket down the road a little further, and let's continue to blame it on something else to get the distraction away from this issue that we know we can't solve right now. I feel like every time violence in video games gets brought up, there is an underlying issue of there's a political reasoning. It's a distraction, a deterrent. Like, here, let's shift your focus over to something that we probably can get laws sent around more so than gun control. How do you fight that one?
Yeah, and I think, there's people that after this whole incident, people, same arguments keep coming up forth about video games. One guy wrote a book about... He was an Army Ranger or something like that. I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head. In training, we use video games to simulate, killing, so you can condition yourself to killing. And I get where he's come from, that you can do that to help, like virtual reality, but it doesn't mean that affects everybody the same way.
Yeah.
You were deliberately using that video game or that VR experience, whatever he was talking about, to the means of being conditioned.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think if you go in the fact of just playing a video game, you're not conditioning yourself to kill people.
Yeah.
But that's me personally when I'm playing a video game. I'm not like, now the study is like, do people that play video games, are they more prone to violence? And I don't know if you're more prone. I think you are overexposed to violence that you don't care as much.
Yeah, I mean, you become numb to it in a sense. Like, your example that you accidentally made was basically just the shootings. You can't remember which one was where because it's like this. It felt like for a while it's like there's a new one every day.
Yeah, you become less sympathetic, which is a terrible thing to say. I don't know if maybe video games help with that because you're already doing all this killing, but I don't see it as that way. Think how many acid attacks there was in London. Yeah. Those numbers increase. I don't even bat an eye about it anymore.
Which is terrible in itself because it almost feels like there is this justification behind, are people in our country worth more than people in other countries? Of course not. But when it's a story happening elsewhere in the world, it seems like our media just doesn't care about it as much because it doesn't get as many views, basically. And so you're trying to say that there's a weight in human life.
And the hard part is it's always about if it doesn't happen to you, you don't really care about it.
Yeah.
There's definitely that
If
thing.
it's not in your backyard or your neighborhood.
Yeah, whatever they say. And these are beyond horrible things that are happening in our world. So if I'm saying I'm numb to that, of course I can be numb to video game violence.
Mhm.
Like there might not even be a correlation, but if I'm numb to mass shootings in our country, I can definitely be numb to video game violence.
Agreed. And I would say this. So the vast majority, like if you go online, you could kind of open some books, open some different research studies and things like that. The norm is there isn't necessarily like a correlation between video games and creating people who are going to do mass shootings. And that obviously the big one is Columbine is the link. A lot of people bring that up.
Doom, right, specifically.
Yeah. I did read, so there was a study in 1963 by Bandura, Ross, and Ross. Basically, it was published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. And then there was another study done in 2017, basically titled Effects of Exposure to Gun Violence in Movies on Children's Interest in Real Guns. So obviously the one in 1963, a lot's changed. But both studies had a similar premise. The one study, it basically showed children, young age children, kindergartners, a blow-up doll and parents hitting it and punching it. And then they let the kids go into a room, and the first thing the kids tried to do was emulate what they saw on the video.
Makes sense.
Well, then the other video was they showed, it was a movie called The Rocketeer and then National Treasure, actually. And they showed two separate groups of kids. One, they showed them with the gun violence in the trailers, and the other one was the edited out gun violence. And they brought them into a room that had Nerf guns, toys, footballs, all this different stuff. And there was also in a drawer an actual live gun, obviously with the bullets removed, but it had a mechanism on it that would keep track if someone pulled the trigger. And there's a whole I won't bore you with a whole bunch of the different stats, but there was stats on the kids who saw the trailer without the guns tend to, some of them would still pick up the Nerf gun, but most of the time, a good majority of them would actually go elsewhere. Where the other ones, the kids would get the Nerf gun and be like, and they start emulating what they're doing. And then the ones that, and the vast majority of people who found the gun would pull the trigger when they had seen what was happening. Because again, they're not doing it to be mean. They're just trying to copy what they saw Mr. Nicolas Cage doing.
And I think that's the big distinction right there.
That's, to me, that is why, and that's why I go back to it's not necessarily that a kid, a person, an individual playing a video game is going to instantly link them to violence. It's going to make kids don't look at it that way, especially young kids. Because the second study with the Rocketeer, it was like kids ages 8 to 12. They just think it looks cool. They just want to see what the adult does. They want to try and see if they can do that. And so that's why I let off at the end of that last segment. I really, really, really think there's an issue of parenting in today's society now. There's so much information that happens nowadays. You're starting to see it where parents will be like, they will throw a kid in front of a TV, a movie, or a video game
But
just
not
so,
guide.
and basically not really filter what they're watching. It's just, hey, do this. I want to go, get alone time for a little bit, or I want to play my video game, or I want to read my book. I want to talk to my friends. And I think, there's obviously the ESRB ratings, I think are they were basically made because publishers and like a lot of like companies like EB Games, not EB Games. Well, there's an older one.
Yeah,
that was an older one, but GameStop, they don't want to get sued by selling something, an underage kid a title, so that rating helps them.
And I think there should be ratings.
Yeah, but to be fair, ratings differ so much in different societies. I mean, what you see in
That's
Japan, for instance,
they don't have as much violent games,
but they also,
for the most part,
but for instance too, like sexual relations between like significantly younger human beings is more of a norm over there. Here, that's it's like,
it's not just,
you can't touch that.
It's not just the underage. It's just like sexually in general.
Yeah,
it's more frowned upon than violence, which is a very interesting. Why is that? I don't know. But it's the culture we grew up in, I guess, and I don't think either one's right or wrong.
Yeah.
With the censorship on both. I mean, you probably shouldn't censor anything for the most part, I think. But
well, you'd also look at it too. I mean, for instance, people talk about like the violence in video games. It's an epidemic in America. Video games are played around the world. And yet we seem to be the ones that have the biggest issue with the violence from that.
I wouldn't say from that.
Oh, okay. We seem to be the ones that have the biggest violence. So is it the correlation between, thank you for correcting me on that.
Yeah, no worries.
Is it video games? Because everyone in the world plays them. Or is it something else? Is it the readily access to firearms potentially? Is it a mental health issue? That's something to maybe think about there.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that, I have a study from July 2016. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it has a guideline on media violence. So not just video game, but media violence. And the video PX warned that violent media set a poor example for kids. Video games, the Academy noted, should not use human or other living targets or award points for killing because this teaches children to associate pleasure and success with their ability to cause pain and suffering to others. End quote. I kind of disagree with that. Then you shouldn't allow sports.
Yeah. I mean, and obviously that could be another discussion. Sports, football especially.
Or hockey and football.
Hockey and football mainly, but
maybe even a little bit of soccer.
I mean, you could even throw in rugby.
There's a big one. And my thing is, we grew up playing video games. We all did. Well, you and I grew up playing, but I've never wanted to add that portion to real life. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not going to deny that getting in a fight or doing I used to do basement boxing with some of my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt satisfying when you won and you beat somebody. So I'm not going to deny that violence can be thrilling.
It's the adrenaline of it.
It's the adrenaline. I mean, why do you think there's so many quote unquote torture porn movies? Because it sells and people enjoy getting that high off of watching violence. But I'm guessing that's probably even part of our DNA code. Some fight or flight thing. We just get an adrenaline rush. Power is intoxicating, but I'm not predisposed. What was that word I'm looking? Predispositioned? Yeah, predispositioned. Yeah. For aggression, I'm a pretty laid back dude. Obviously, I yell at video games when I get angry and stuff, but so I can't, if I'm looking at violence in a video game, and if I'm not predisposed to an aggressive behavior, I can't really correlate anything. But if somebody were sitting down and watching violence, let's say on Doom, because that was the whole Columbine thing, if they kept watching that and they enjoyed that and it made them want to do it more, the video game is just a catalyst. That person was already like that to begin with.
That's, I think the bigger point there is that a video game issue, or is that a video game kind of enabling an issue that was already in that individual, and that's more of a mental health thing? I will say you made an interesting point too. You let out aggression when you're playing video games. In a way, isn't that kind of almost a good thing? You're allowing, hey, you've had a stressful day. Some people go to the gym. Some people, they'll go on a run. Some people, you play a video game, you kind of let out some emotions that you would. I mean, it's never good to hold in stuff. You're decompressing, exactly. I will say, though, there's an interesting facet in violence in video games. So Grand Theft Auto, that series, obviously, in general, it's
been in the media.
It's been in the media a lot. But there's something really interesting that I do think there is a minor issue in that the visual of what happens is important. In that if you're driving, because obviously for those of you who don't play Grand Theft Auto, I'm sure you've at least heard of it, you can aimlessly drive around and run people over when they're going across a crosswalk. Just, terrible things. Let's say you hit a random individual. A lot of times once you started playing it for a while, you're just trying to get through your objective. You don't care. But if that individual is like an elderly lady with a cane or on a wheelchair, suddenly you feel bad about that. And I do think so. At least I do.
Okay.
That says something to me though. I don't think twice about it if it's just someone in a suit and a briefcase or whatever. And then all of a sudden, as soon as it's
a normal age man and woman is fine, but elderly or young,
which that's
gray area.
But that shows you something. Does that mean I'm is there something wrong there in that facet? That's a good way to kind of look at it in that sense. You can kind of analyze, because obviously I know in real life you don't do that. A human life is a human life. You don't ever come close to doing that. It is fascinating to me when I started thinking about this subject.
Where do you think you learned that?
The good and the bad?
Yeah.
I mean, that's parenting. I mean, that's now, for instance, not to bring religion into it, but that's a big way. For instance, the teachings of the Bible. You can believe whatever you want. You can believe it. You can not believe it. I do think one at least healthy outcome of it is they are teaching people the difference between good and bad. And you're giving someone reasons.
Which is also subjective.
Exactly. It very much is. But you're technically helping people understand that, theft, violence is wrong. Helping your neighbor, yada yada, is right. So like there is some semblance that the Bible has some things correct in that facet, but there's other things too. Just like your parents growing up, society, understanding that your neighbor next to you, your friends, your kids that you're in school with, you're all like, you learn kind of what you like, what you don't like, and maybe the kid sitting next to the desk next to you, maybe he doesn't like that either, or she doesn't like that either, and I think that's why community is a big aspect to learning right from wrong. And that continues to adapt because this whole new era that we're in, what's right and what's wrong, what's private and what's not, is continuing to change. And for me, the big thing at the end of the day when it comes to violence in games or violence in general, I wrote down, I truly 100% believe context matters. You can't have violence just to be violent. I think there has to be a reasoning behind it. I will never have an issue with there being violence in a video game as long, and I keep using the word justified, if it's justified and it's part of the story or it's an offshoot or a...
I'll look at GTA then. I mean, that's not part of the story at all.
I don't... and again, I'm not necessarily a fan of the fact that you can just barrel through people, okay? I get it. But that's obviously what GTA is kind of going for. They're giving you that free roam ability. That's just the video. You have to be able to, in that sense, and I mean, that actually asks a really good point. Is that needed? No.
But it's fun.
But it's entertaining in the fact that,
for me.
Yeah. Well, and so in that facet, you have to be able to, you have to have a good mind, a good mental stability to be like, listen, this is ridiculous that this is happening. But understand this is not reality. You can't go out and just drive down, downtown Minneapolis running into people left and right. You don't do that.
So I wonder, going back to the kids things, if a kid only played violent video games, would he be predisposed or not predisposed? Would he adapt and start fighting people? I don't know. I think you would have to watch so much. You're going in the instance that this kid was not taught anything else. He was just sat in front of a TV and played video games all day, every day, and then went out and interacted with people. I mean that study shows that they emulate. Emulate's a big thing. So if you...
Children are sponges.
They just absorb everything. So if you're just going to sit your kid in front of a TV and don't give them any guidelines or anything like that, then yeah, you're doing a disservice to that kid because the kid sees it's happening. Especially with these games becoming very much more lifelike, you might not even know the difference. I'm manipulating this person. Cool.
Well, and that's why, again, I'll just come down to it. I think the violence in video games or violence in media talk needs to shift. And the focus needs to be on parenting, social media, how easily, I mean, just imagine for us, for instance, like if we grew up now, like we were teenagers right now, with the access to how easy it is that, with your phone, when we grew up, the internet on phones really, like that was a struggle. And so it's kind of one of those scenarios where like we need to shift this away because the big problem is, and you brought up the point, Mr. Trump, and he's not the first president, he's not the first political figure who is blamed the violence in social media, TVs and stuff like that. I think at the end of the day, one of the big problems is there's a giant, for lack of a better term, wall in this country of those who are for guns and those who are against guns. Those are for mental health and those who kind of just don't want to talk about it. And because of that, because there's so much money on both sides of that, it's like, okay, well, let's not touch those and let's go try and find other excuses when here is our issues. And until people understand that they're mentally, I think humans are a lot more susceptible to potential influence than, especially kids especially. Like,
yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
I do think my biggest takeaway from this, and obviously being a parent now, it's changed me a lot more. You just have to monitor what your kids are doing. Like their text messages, every once in a while, you got to check in on them. Just like, hey, how's it going? What are they watching? If all of a sudden they kind of hide their phone from you, what's going on? Like you have to be able to have those hard, just tough decisions in your life. You have to talk with them because it's too easy nowadays to get lost in a lot of those things. And that's why for me, I don't think the violence is always going to be there because people are going to be allowed to share the story they want to share. It's who has access to that, I think, is what's important.
And what age
Yes. And I think the education and the teaching behind, hey, this isn't right. Like that's important too.
Agreed. So again, what does it all mean? I think you treat mental health, obviously. You don't limit ours, though, in that response. Just because somebody does something that you're offended by, that's a good conversation to have. That doesn't mean one side is right or the other. You stay free in that regard.
Yes,
freedom is important. I agree. You want you want violence in games. If you want violence in games, like a creator.
I was going to say that was an awkward pause.
And I was like, how am I wording this? You can have as much as you want. You can go as far as you want, and that's your freedom. And I think you need to protect that. You're going to upset somebody. Just like when TLoU got out, all these articles spewed up. Is it too violent? Is it too disturbing? Is it too realistic? Especially when TLoU Part 2 got showed at was it Gamescom last year? 2 years ago?
2 years ago, the one with the mom and the yeah.
And the reason that one bugged me a little bit is because they didn't show any warnings. And, you're assuming video games are very mainstream nowadays. You assume kids are watching that. That should have had a little disclaimer. But if that's the world you want to create, that's the story you're going for, obviously you can do that. And Naughty Dog is doing that again. So don't let anyone stop you out there. Don't make the story you want to do, but make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Like you said, have it justified to the story. Tell the story to make it fit. Don't do it just because. And heck, if you just want to do it just because you want to do it too, you can, I guess.
Oh, see,
that was a statement in itself, right?
That's what I was going to kind of just chime in about real quick is just, the whole thing is the point is freedom. If there's someone out there who legitimately wants to just make a game that's violent because that's kind of the addiction to it, that should be up to the consumer to decide, okay, this is a little too much. We're not.
I think the consumer part is big because there was a Steam game and it was just basically a kid going through and doing a mass shooting.
Yes, I remember that.
Like me, that creates a really hard spot. Like, should you be allowed to do that? You kind of should be. It's freaking distasteful and disgusting.
But Steam should also have the right. Valve should have the right.
Which they said no.
Yeah,
they're like, I'm gonna just wash my hands for you. Consumers will dictate what happens, and that's how it should be. I think it's distasteful and disgusting, and you know what? That's going to paint a picture of the creator in my head.
There's also a very small percentage of you shouldn't punish.
Exactly. And that's the part of
actions of
that's what I was going to go with on that trajectory. It's a two-way street. You can do all these distasteful things in your games, but then you have to live with that. You created that, and you have to justify the reason. So you don't censor yourself, but also be willing. You got to take flack if you're going to do something that's either disgusting, vile, or whatever.
Yeah. At the end of the day, my big takeaway is we need to move the discussion from violence in movies and TV and switch it over to the mental health side, making sure, is this we need to do more studies. We need to figure out more of what effects do they have? And again, it needs to be not just in kids and adults. I do think kids are, I honestly would even be up for parenting classes and things like that in high school or college or something, maybe making some things more where it's, people need to understand that you need to take an active role in children's life. And it doesn't have to even be your kids. It's the community aspect of that. If there are kids around, you should act potentially a little differently. Now, again, does that infringe upon, hey, just because a kid is around, do I have to act like a... You should, though.
That's a big thing, yeah.
And so it kind of comes down to, I think, parenting, mental health awareness, those are all issues we need to continue to kind of just keep talking about and just... keep the discussion open. Don't instantly just blame violence just to blame violence. If there's a story behind it, you got to remember, whenever a video game, movie, TV show comes out, there are hundreds of people, sometimes there's only one or two people, behind the scenes who have worked long, hard hours to try and show you something. And for you to, as soon as you see that game without having any justification towards what the story is, any of that, and you just bash them by writing an article or posting something on Twitter, that's so unfair to them. Granted, again, that's free too. So this is where that double-edged sword comes into it.
And we're also we grew up with video games, so we're in the culture of video games. Sometimes,
of course.
Sometimes I actually dislike gaming culture because, any culture, you put up walls to other people and justify, oh, I'm a real gamer because this. No, you're dumb. You can be a gamer however you want to be. But I don't like that Donald Trump said those three things. We talk about video game violence.
We just
we're back to that because this discussion went away for a long time.
That does come down to too. I think the fact that you just bring that up again. Look at the majority of news media outlets nowadays, obviously they're all run by adults. A lot of the writers and stuff behind the scenes. When you look at those three things, two of them you associate with, at least as an adult, and that it's movies and TV. One of them, the older generation doesn't.
He said the internet things, or
Okay.
internet stuff, or something.
All right, but like you kind of associate like video games. That's something that correlates right to children because children play video games. I feel like
And they're just making more money than movies are in the opening box office. It's like, just wake up, people.
Yeah.
But that's how it is. I don't know if this discussion helped anything.
No, well, I think to me this just kind of opened up my eyes that like there's been multiple times during this conversation I've had to think like I don't like that the discussion comes into whenever you say something you kind of have to double take and be like, well, yeah, okay, but that also makes sense for this side. So for instance, I mentioned the comment parenting, if you're out and about, you should probably respect the fact there are children around. But if you want to truly be free, why should it be someone who doesn't have a kid? Why do they have to pay attention to how they act? It's
Around else's kids.
So,
a stranger's kid, potentially. Not even, I mean, maybe if you're in a community, a neighborhood or whatever, you have a common string attaching you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're just, that's weird, man. If you're a stranger, why do I have to care?
It's difficult.
I can swear around this kid.
Yeah. So my takeaway at the end of the day is basically, I don't think violence in video games is an issue. I think who is subjected to those violence in video games should maybe be looked at a little more in that there should not be a law saying like a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old can't go see or do this if they're not with a parent. Like if a parent,
but that's already there.
But no, what I'm saying is like, but a parent can rent a movie on Netflix or something and just show a kid.
That's true. Oh, you're
not
saying
even
like
rent, just show. There shouldn't necessarily be hard limits because kids develop at different routes. Like, and violence is, how do you choose like what's more violent than something else?
That's
someone
true.
getting shot and killed, is that worse than someone getting kicked off of a building and they're dying and splattering? I mean, like it's like there's different levels of violence, or
or even the implied
violence.
You kick them off and you don't show the splatter.
Yeah, and see, I mean, I'm even going back a little bit on that. It's just it's hard. I think the big takeaway from this is like this is a hard subject to talk about. You see why nothing really ever gets done, but I think what I would love to see happen is just more people talk about that, in our massive community that we've built here with Games Gone. I would love
We're
to
small
hear,
but awesome.
Yeah, let's hear some discussions. Like get going. I know Twitter's harder to have discussions on, but go over to Facebook, our Facebook.com/Games Gone. I always want to say / for some reason. Like let's get some people talking about stuff and just kind of seeing what are your issues with it.
People talking about stuff. Larry in quotes.
Yeah, that was pretty off. That should be a T-shirt.
Get people talking about stuff. So yeah, violent video games. That was our discussion. We wanted to do something a little bit different, and we did. And I think even if we didn't conclude on anything, well, we might have. I think we thought provoking, something to think about.
We thought provoking.
We thought provoking.
There's your quote.
We thought provoking. Hey. So. Violence in video games. Nothing you should laugh at. Or should you? It's your freedom of speech, I guess. Maybe it'll make you think of something. Are video games too violent? Should I be showing my 2-year-old all this violence? I don't know.
Talk amongst
Do
yourselves.
2-year-olds like know things? I don't know.
Their brains are sponges, man.
Yeah.
They absorb stuff.
There's a reason why there's psychology classes on kid psychology and all that jazz. I was a teacher at one point. I should know these things, but long days.
I wonder why they always say all that jazz. Why not like all that pop?
All that funk.
I
like that. All that funk.
I do kind of like all that funk, all that rock, all that rap,
all that country.
all that
Country rolling hills.
all that bluegrass.
All that bluegrass. Why? And this is the weirdest way to end this conversation. But if you enjoyed that weird rant that we just had, follow us over on Apple Podcasts, Games Gone, everywhere you can find a podcast, most likely. If not, message us. I'd like to know where it's not at. Have a lovely weekend. Or have a lovely week.